All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Sunnybrook Medventions Lecture Series that is co-organized by Sunnybrook Research Institute, the Innovate Network, and University of Toronto. My name is Ahmed Nassif. I'm the Programs Manager of the Medventions Training Program at Sunnybrook. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land where the University of Toronto operates, the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are very grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Today, I'm very delighted to have our guest speaker, Stefano Piccone, who has generously delivered many seminars and workshops for Medventions on a wide variety of topics, including investments, investors, cap tables, term sheets, and valuations in early seed funding. And today we'll be talking to us about financial models and business development for early stage companies. Before we start our session, a couple of housekeeping announcements. Please, as we continue to plan the lecture series, please consider joining our e-newsletter, which is accessible through the Sunnybrook Medventions website. This is, again, the best way to stay in the know about any upcoming activities and events. This session is being recorded and will be available for later viewing. So please note by joining this event, you agree to be recorded and that Sunnybrook and the University of Toronto may use the recording for educational purposes. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at ahmed.nassif@sunnybrook.ca. For medical biophysics students who are taking that course for credit, please note that your final presentations are now scheduled for March 30th after the class, and I'll be emailing you with more details about the presentations and the order of groups presenting. So now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker for tonight. Stefano is the Vice President of Finance and Business Development at Canavi Medical. He oversees the company day-to-day financial activities and is actively involved in fundraising and business development. He also serves as the President of Canavi Medical at the United States, which is the company's wholly owned US operation. He has extensive experience with life science venture finance and again has been an invited presenter at the Sunnybrook Medventions Lecture Series, as well as to the Ontario Bioscience Innovation Organization. Stefano has a Bachelor of Commerce from the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto and is a member of the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. Stefano, we are very grateful to have you participate again in this year's lecture series, and thank you for being here. And with that, I'll passing it over to you to get us started.
Thank you, Ahmed. And again, thank you for all you do in helping to organize these lecture series. Again, I think we were talking before we started. I think this is my 10th time or 10th year doing this, and I think you've probably been involved for maybe 7 or 8 of those years. So again, really appreciate it. Glad to be here. Ahmed gave a little bit of my bio, and certainly my sort of day job is I'm with Canavi Medical, which is some people might be aware of is a Sunnybrook spinout. But I'm also on the board of XPAN, which was a company that was founded by somebody shortly after they graduated from undergrad at U of T. Zaid Addo, some of the people might be familiar with him, and then he actually did the Medventions program at Sunnybrook. And it's been really interesting being involved in the two companies and sort of informally helped a number of companies over time, but being involved in both projects and having a lot of learnings through both. And I can assure you that there are a lot of different mistakes that you can make in medical device finance and business development. I'm pretty sure I've made them all. And so, I don't want to give the impression that I'm one of these people that kind of knows everything and sort of was blessed with an understanding from day one. This has been a long journey, a long process. And, part of the reason I do this is to try and, help other people in the ecosystem so they can sort of learn through some of the things that I've gone through and hopefully not make the same mistakes. And one thing to note is this lecture is really kind of geared towards people that are interested in starting a company. But that being said, if you're interested in joining a startup or even joining a more mature medical device company, I think you will still find this helpful. So in terms of an agenda, so I'll just break it up into 2 parts. The first part is the lecture, which we'll talk about some sort of finance and business development concepts. I think most people, sort of the preamble talked about financial modeling and stuff like that. I'm not going to go into the tactical, which some of the people might find surprising. It's going to be more kind of high-level strategic stuff. which, quite frankly, I mean, you can produce, the best, most accurate or sort of most detailed financial model possible and things like that. But if you're not pointing in the right direction, it really doesn't mean anything. So I want to hammer home some really key strategic things that, again, when I started my journey 10 plus years ago, I wish I knew. And then also, as part of the workshop, really just provide a blueprint for a device startup. So let's say you were somebody, I know there's a lot of students in the biomedical physics program here. Let's say you were thinking, oh, I want to start a company, but you're probably looking at it like, how? So for somebody like me that's been in this for 10 years, and I joined Canavi at a very early stage. I pretty much joined XPen day one. I've kind of seen kind of best practices for how to start these things. And I can share some learnings and at least what I feel to be a template for how to get started and how to get started and how to build towards sort of an exit in a capital efficient manner. So that's what I sort of have planned. Please ask questions. Ahmed, if you see anything come through the chat, please feel free to stop me, or anybody else if you just want to chat and interject, feel free. I really don't want this to be sort of just me kind of on top of a soapbox talking. Any interaction would be greatly appreciated. Before we get started, though, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about all the craziness that's happened over the past week or so. Which many of you might be familiar with Silicon Valley Bank, which was very unfortunate. So for those that don't know, Silicon Valley Bank, which I think was founded in the very early 80s, was sort of the bank of choice with many early stage companies, particularly in the United States, startups, huge medical device presence. They used to annually or biannually would produce a medical device sort of report that was excellent. So really a trusted partner and trusted bank for so many groups. And unfortunately, late last week, ran into basically a bank run. And just to describe that very briefly, so every bank, if you think about even your personal bank, when you put money in there, essentially every dollar you put in, it's both an asset and a liability to the bank. It's an asset in the sense that they can turn around and they can loan it. For example, most Canadian banks, they'll turn that into mortgages, residential mortgages, because they have to put that capital to work because they're a business. But at the same time, they owe you $1. What happened with Silicon Valley Bank was, 2021, 2022, there was a lot of capital injected into the ecosystem to help us survive COVID. Central banks just were printing money, and a lot of startups were able to raise a lot of money. And so, they deposited a lot in Silicon Valley Bank. And Silicon Valley Bank, I mean, its major source of income was loaning money to startups. And actually its loan to deposit ratio was quite low. So it had all this extra capital and didn't know what to do with it. And so what it did was it took a whole bunch and invested in long-term bonds, which ended up being highly problematic because interest rates started going way up. I mean, as we entered 2023, central banks realized that to control inflation, they had to increase interest rates. And so all those bonds that were like, would mature in 10 years and would pay yields of like 2%, totally dropped in value. And also at the same time, startups were kind of withdrawing their deposits anyways. So this combination of startups withdrawing because they were raising less money, and then also people realizing like, hey, their deposits were worth way less. They took a huge bath. They had to take a huge write down. Scared a lot of folks. And think about it, think about today. Let's say, I don't know, you bank at CIBC, RBC, et cetera, and somebody said, oh, I think if you would draw money, it might not be there. Think about what everyone would do. They would basically just run to the ATM to try to get their money out as soon as possible. And that's what ended up happening with Silicon Valley Bank. I mean, for the most part, they were actually in decent position, but the perception that they were going down is eventually what led to their downfall. And what happened was the US government, they have an entity called the FDIC, had to take them over and basically had to secure all the deposits. So companies would be assured that they would get their money out. Because think about it, there were companies that, the medical device company iRhythm, that had 55 million in Silicon Valley Bank, and yet they were, only insured for 250 of that. So the government had to step in and basically say like, hey, listen, we will secure all these deposits. We will make sure that you get your money. So they do have their money now. The only issue is that it's caused investors, probably rightfully so, maybe they were just turning a blind eye for a while, to really look at how banks have been investing their monies, what other risky assets they have. And so you've heard other concerns. There was First Republic, then there was Credit Suisse today. So there's a little bit of contagion in the banking sector. There's also some pushback to say, well, should deposits be 100% guaranteed? Ultimately, it's going to be the banks that have to pay for that because they're going to have to pay higher insurance rates because they have to insure these deposits. But yeah, I mean, in the last week or so, we saw a really potentially existential event for not just the medtech community, but all of innovation. I think the reason I'm bringing this up is, I mean, number one, finance or even being in a startup, things change instantly. You have to be prepared for a roller coaster. But if you were starting a company, ask yourself, this is a good barometer, ask yourself, would you be prepared to go through this whole ordeal where knowing, like having to survive like a 72-hour period where conceivably your company could have collapsed because of something completely outside your control? And if the answer is yes, because there is a greater purpose to helping patients, advancing technology, et cetera, that's great. If the answer is no, this juice isn't worth the squeeze, that's fine. But this is an interesting barometer because there were a lot of people in a 72-hour period between the time that the bank collapsed and then the deposits were fully secured. There are a lot of people, a lot of companies that were thinking like, is this it? Is my company done for? So a very interesting barometer. If you feel, you can, all the finance knowledge and everything, whatever business, technology, IP, et cetera, it means if you don't have the fortitude, and if you don't have the fortitude, that's fine. I mean, it's totally fine. There's nothing, it's just, it's a personal question that you have to answer and a personal choice you have to make. But this is an interesting barometer. Could you have survived this situation of knowing that, and again, this happened over the weekend. It wasn't, it's like people essentially sitting there over Twitter over the weekend trying to figure out what's going on. So fortunately, it has a happy ending so far. I mean, that could very well change. We'll see what happens. Hopefully, we don't have more bank contagion and other banks failing. But this was, it was timely. I mean, initially when I prepared this deck, I think it was a week and a half ago, I didn't have this in there. And then I realized, just before I was having this presentation, I'm like, I should probably make mention of this because it's a pretty big deal. So anyways, I do see one question in the chat. Yeah, so deposits were initially secured up to, somebody mentioned the secures deposits up to 250,000. Yeah, that was what the FDIC initially secured them up to. But think about it. Think if you're a company and you're decently well funded, you probably have millions. Or think about like VCs. VCs had their monies in these banks. They couldn't get access to them. It would have been a huge issue had the government said, "Oh, yeah, let's just let them fail." So, anyways, that was just my little spiel on Silicon Valley Bank. But Conavi did a little business many years ago with them. We ended up closing it. Just for other reasons. They were a great partner. They were great to work with, great information, put on great events. So it was really kind of sad and unfortunate to see them that they're no longer in existence. Anyway, so moving on to the actual lecture, finance, there's a lot of, I've been working in finance for like 20 years. I mean, I got my, CPA and, spent many years, but really like when it comes to, medical device startups and companies and just even any investment in general, there's really only two equations you have to be mindful of. And it's really important that like pretty much every time I make decisions, I make them through these two lenses. And the first one is ultimately when you're looking at when you make an investment is how much cash are you taking out versus how much cash is going into a business. So if you think about, let's say you sell a business for, I don't know, $350 million, but 300 million went into it. I mean, if you look at that ratio, it's not great. Versus a business, let's say you sell a business for 50 million and you had 2 million in, that's great. And it's interesting because unfortunately in the innovation community, I find that in a lot of cases, we celebrate companies that have raised big amounts of money. And I know you need money to do things, it's not indisputable, but there's something to be said for trying to maximize this ratio. And, I was Canadian company, I won't name them, but they raised a fair chunk of cash recently. It was over 30 million. Earlier stage company, and I think they have a very compelling technology, but for a very important clinical need. But it's like based on the amount they're going to have to raise, they're going to have to win. Like they're going to have to absolutely win out in their clinical domain. which, they're going to need, a $500 million exit in order to really get there. By comparison, there's another company that I know of that is in the process of getting acquired. They had very, very little cash in. They just got an offer, very attractive, and they're not going to make the news. Nobody's going to be like, the acquirer is probably not going to mention it because it's so small. They're not going to get Globe and Mail, anything. But if you look at the economics of the deal, like when I look at companies and I look at how you build them, how you run them, the more you can do with less, the better. And that sounds, maybe that sounds trite or whatnot, but and I'll as part of this blueprint, I'll tell you how you can do that. Like I'll explain to you how you do this. But I think the thing is that people, a lot of times people get enamored with seeing like big fundraisers. And like Canavi 2 years ago, a little 18 months ago, we raised like 22 million US. And everyone's like, oh my God, that's amazing. It's like, well, yeah, but every time you raise money, the expectation of what you have to return goes up considerably. And that's just a lot of pressure. I mean, there's a lot of complications that come with taking money. So the more you can do with less, the better. The best example of this in terms of cash in, at least in terms of outside equity, I mean, Bayless sold for 1.75 billion to Boston Scientific. That's US dollars. Never had a single dollar of outside equity that came into the business. Now they did reinvest a lot they reinvested a lot from products they divested and internal operations and stuff like that. So one could argue that there was considerable cash in, but a $1.75 billion exit on zero outside equity, that's like, it doesn't get better than that. So whenever I'm thinking about finance, I always look at sort of those ratios. The second thing that I think is way overrated, or sorry, is underappreciated, is the importance of time. And so you're actually not trying to sort of optimize for your multiple, you're trying to optimize for your annualized return. And so this is formula is basically, your annualized return is your multiple, and then it's 1 over t minus 1. And it's derived from this very simple compound interest formula. I mean, imagine most people online, I think you can follow where I get this from. But it's the idea that, again, if you can build a company in a capital efficient manner, which is again your X, but also exit in a timely manner, that is also critical. And I think that medical device companies, they tend to take a long time. I think the median time to exit is probably 7 to 10 years. But if you can do something or hit a milestone sooner, which is accretive and returns money to your shareholders, that could actually be better than having to raise more money and eventually getting a bigger exit, simply because you needed more time to execute on your plan. So what does this mean if we were to put it into sort of a table? If you were to compare sort of multiples over time. And actually, ironically, when I gave a talk at Sunnybrook for the first time 10 years ago, I'm 99% sure I had the same table in there. If you compare sort of years versus exit multiple, what this means in terms of a compounded annual rate of return. And let's say you use, investors are typically looking for 40% plus compounded annual rate of return for something that's risky, like an illiquid company, privately held, that you can't just sell your shares, and it's going to take a while to materialize, and the probability of it happening is far from certain. So if you use, in this case, I use kind of 30% as the hurdle rate, and that's so anything highlighted in yellow is over the hurdle rate. But yeah, a 3x in 3 years, for example, provides a better return than a 5x in 6 years. And so, it's really cognizant, it's like time. I say this a lot in Canavi, like time is the great enemy. Time is time's also an enemy because you're burning cash, and time is money, yada, yada, yada. But when it comes to returns, man, the faster you can go, the better. And I think one of the issues is when you're starting a company for the first time, mistakes cost you, both in terms of you having to spend more, but also spend more time, and then that just hurts the returns. And that's one of the reasons why, when it's a lot of people that are successful with medical device companies, it's not their first rodeo. And again, I look at, being involved with XPAN now and a lot of the lessons I've learned at Canavian. It's fortunate because I've learned from some very capable and intelligent people, but XPAN, it's like the messaging is Canavian, we went big, we're trying to finish big. XPAN, it's like quick, lean, let's see what we can get to. If we need to get farther, it's okay. But it's a really, like I'd say we are super, super capital efficient with that business. And so, yeah, and I would much rather be involved with a company that's, raised 2 million and using it properly than a company that's raised, hypothetically like 100 million. And, is like, even if it's, it's getting its name in the paper and getting a lot of accolades, no, that's ultimately not where investors are sort of leaning towards. There are some, nuances in this discussion as it relates to VCs and the timeline of their fund and their ability to turn things over, which, every so often can complicate things. But fundamentally, when you're thinking about finance, you're thinking about maximizing that multiple and doing so as quickly as possible. And honestly, if you have those two factors, if you can, and it's not a learning thing. It's not an intelligence. It's a mindset thing. It's a mindset about, I'm going to be lean, I'm going to be disciplined, I'm going to be fast, because that's not always easy. Because a lot of times, and we'll talk about this, to do that, you have to say no to a lot. And you have to really focus, and you have to set some very specific goals that, aren't, maybe the most dreamy. It's like you just kind of, you got to be ruthlessly practical about things in order to operate this way. So it's more about, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a little bit in a later slide, but anyways, that if there's anything, again, you're not going to see anything truly tactical in this presentation. You're going to see themes like this, and it's things again about maximizing your multiple and minimizing the time to exit. So that's sort of the first big thing I want to cover. The second thing is, and I didn't realize this until maybe I was a little bit later in my career, but the medical device ecosystem is super build to buy. And meaning that, the industry is so consolidated. I mean, even look earlier this year, Abiomed, which was publicly traded, well in excess of $1 billion of revenues, got bought by Johnson & Johnson for $14 billion or something like that. I forget their revenues at the time of exit. But this is, an industry with huge consolidation. There was another publicly traded company in the cardiovascular space, Cardiovascular Systems, which was trading for just under $1 billion, got bought by Abbott. Like, it is an industry that is dominated by multinationals. And so let's look at an ecosystem like Minneapolis or a Boston or a Bay Area, where they have a lot of these multinationals where they're headquartered. The reason that they have really efficient ecosystems is so, somebody, let's say they're getting an engineering degree or they're coming out of school, they go to work for them. They go to work for one of these big multinationals. They learn best practices. They learn the game. They learn how, and this is very much an apprentice-based business. You could be the smartest person in the world. I mean, you could be a gifted engineer, but if you don't know the ins and outs of, how the medical device industry works, and even, things about quality and design controls, and knowing how to sort of balance the two and whatnot, it doesn't matter. I mean, you need practical experience in order to, or some very, very good mentors in order to be able to, kind of be able to do things on your own. So most of the people that go to these companies and they learn. And so you have a huge pools of skilled talent. And in a lot of cases, this talent goes, oh, I've gone through the process. I've gone through product development before and whatnot. And, maybe somebody in academia who's got an idea, and it's like, okay, I want to start a company. So then they go and they start their companies. And you have the venture capital ecosystem there, which again is predominantly sort of exists, and again in the Boston, the Bay Area, Minneapolis, et cetera. And they say, okay, we're going to seed these companies, we're going to invest in them. And then these startup companies are going to create new products, which then, end up getting acquired by multinationals. And, the venture capitalists, they essentially exist between the multinationals and the startups. I mean, if you meet a VC that's very, very good, you'll see that they have very strong relationships again, with sort of the business development or corporate development groups of the major multinationals, but at the same time, they sort of know the players in academia at the lower levels that are coming spinning off the ideas. And so essentially all it is a cycle. And, I think if you're, one of the issues with Canada is we don't have the multinationals here. We don't have, we have some presence, we have companies, big employers. Baylis was definitely one, Synaptive, Profound, even Canavi, IntelliJoint, et cetera, that are hiring more people, 7D Surgical, et cetera, that are hiring more people. We don't have a Medtronic here. And the hope is that one day, we will have sort of a standalone kind of Medtronic level company, because we produce the research, but quite frankly, in order to generate the returns necessary, you need to kind of follow this process. Because if you do try to go standalone, I think Canavi made this mistake, and I've seen others do it. If you try to go standalone from day one, it's too difficult. But if you build to buy, where somebody's going to acquire you, you can always walk away. You can always say no, because if somebody's trying to buy you, you can always be like, no, I don't. You have huge leverage over investors. So when you set up your company, it is absolutely critical to start with the end in mind and to know who are the companies that are most likely to acquire me. And if you have a big pool of potential acquirers, you are in really good shape. And and it's funny, it was first told to me 2015, and it did not register at the time. And you'd think but how critical that is. It's really, it drives a lot of stuff. And just the mentality, again, to start with the end in mind. And it's and again, we'll talk about why, that's more a function of discipline than anything, because again, it's really this romantic notion to think that I'm going to start a company, I'm going to run it forever, and blah, 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 and we're going to be this big, massive success and continue. And, I'm going to hire a lot of people, and, maybe that happens, but if you build it such that it can potentially be acquired, you can always walk away, right? But if you try to build it where there isn't really a path to acquisition, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to raise capital, because again, of where these VCs fit. And you really have to sort of respect and follow what their strategy is and what their game is. So what is it that the multinationals are really looking for is, first off, and you'll hear this you're going to hear this, as a theme in other presentations. You're going to need a larger growing market in need of innovation. It's a very consolidated industry. So, there are certainly exceptions, but for the most part, nobody's going to buy a company that's, maybe the market is, $10 million. You got to be looking at a total addressable market, at least globally, of north of $500 million. I think that's sort of like the lower limit. That's not to say it won't happen, but I'm just saying, you need to go after an important problem, which seems obvious, right? It seems, but that is critical. Then the unfortunate thing in medical devices, it's like anything else, where there are every so often certain themes pop up. I've seen things like renal denervation, even mitral valve, et cetera, where you'll just see something super hot, and then all of a sudden that will be the thing that everyone's going after. And and I'm not saying that you necessarily shouldn't follow the herd. I'm just saying that whatever idea, whatever clinical area you're working on, just stress test it to make sure that, there's a big enough market that a multinational is going to be interested in this. The second thing is you really, really got to focus on the US. The US is by far the most important medical device market. It has a disproportionate number of KOLs. It's the market. It's the home market for many of these countries. It's the largest, with a handful of exceptions for certain technologies, but for the most part, it's the biggest. You really got to be laser focused on the United States. And I feel sad when I say this, but you can pretty much ignore Canada. And I'm sad because ultimately the reason you do this is for patients. And it's unfortunate that when we develop these technologies, it's like Canada is sort of, it's not the priority. With that being said, there are advantages to doing stuff locally, clinical studies and whatnot. You don't have to travel as far. It was certainly helpful during COVID. but it's like you got to focus on the US market first and foremost, improving yourself and demonstrating your technology in that market. So you got to be laser focused there. And then lastly, these businesses, like any business, you're looking for really, really high margin recurring revenue. And what that means is that so recurring revenue is essentially something that once you get it into the hospital, it's used over and over and over, and there is a marginal sort of or an incremental fee for having used it. So disposables, for example, people love disposable businesses. Like in Canavi's case, we have a capital component and then disposables, which it's very, very difficult selling capital, very difficult, because hospitals don't budget for it. They don't get paid to buy capital. They have to sort of set aside a surplus or find money from a foundation or do something like that. But once you get it in there, you sort of have a moat. You have a barrier to entry. But you really, it's important to have like a recurring revenue stream. That is, $1 million that is of recurring revenue is worth far more than a one-time capital sale of $1 million. Far more in terms of the value that and you think about it, I mean, if you're running a business, you want things to be predictable, you want things to be stable, and then it has to be super high margin, 70% plus. You need to be in, and the reason this is the case, so medical device companies have what's called really high operating leverage. So they have which means that their fixed costs relative to their variable costs tend to be much higher. And if you think about what medical device companies tend to have to invest in a lot is sales forces. So like if you look at a Medtronic, a Boston, an Abbott, et cetera, the most valuable thing they have are boots on the ground. And what they want is they want one more tool or one more product that they can give to their existing sales force, that sales force can turn around and basically, while they're in the hospital, they can sell it along with all the other products that they have. So they, that basically high margin revenue goes straight to their bottom line because they don't necessarily need to pay more salespeople. They already have market access people to work on reimbursement and other things. So, and by the way, I won't discuss this here, but the secret to high margin revenue isn't just being able to manufacture for as low a cost as possible. It's also being able to drive reimbursement. And reimbursement, especially in the US, is extraordinarily complicated. It is like, I mean, it's one of those things I find where, the more you learn about it, the less you actually know, because you just like, well, what about this? And ultimately it's driven by data. It's driven by studies that show that, what you are doing provides better outcomes at a lower cost. Ultimately, it is very data driven. Although there are some political and lobbying aspects, et cetera. But it's good to remember that margins are a function both of your COGS and your reimbursed what you're paid for by the provider, and to drive that to 70% plus, that is hugely important. And ultimately, what the multinationals are looking for is what's really called a bolt-on acquisition. They're not looking for businesses that they kind of have to grow and develop for the most part. They're looking for something, again, where they can just kind of bolt it on, add it on, and it's super accretive. Now, there's definitely exceptions where there's really strong product synergies and stuff like that. But, like I can assure you, business development, corporate development people, they're like anybody else. And, it's like the path of least resistance wins. And the other thing is, the other reason this is the case is, I'd say maybe a decade ago, maybe a little bit less, maybe 5+ years ago, there were earlier stage acquisitions where the multinationals bought companies that were earlier stage, had more technology risk, but they didn't work out. And what they have decided, multinationals would much rather pay a premium for a company that has de-risked things technically and has commercial traction. So like they would much rather pay, I don't know, $350 million for a company that's, proved it's done 20 million of revenue or something like that, than they would 100 million for a company that's, or 50 million even for a company that's that doesn't have clearance or something like that. So they're willing to pay a premium if you're able to get there. So those are sort of the things that they are really, really looking for. I mean, there's other things obviously in terms of your IP position, making sure it's solid and all that, the technology. There's other aspects, but these I believe everything kind of sort of it all kind of bubbles up to this. So what's interesting is unfortunately, and as I've learned, inventors and scientists have a terrible reputation in sort of the medical technology and sort of venture capital community, particularly clinician scientists. And that's unfortunate. And it took me a while to figure out why. And it's because, so if you think about, like, let's say you're a real inventor, let's say you're a real scientist. What you are focused on, you're focused on developing something novel, something new, right? You want to be expansive. You're thinking about all the opportunities that might exist. You're meant to be creative, right? You exist in really small teams. I mean, typically, like, invention is usually just a handful of folks. And all you're thinking about is trying to get to proof of concept, which is kind of like proving that something can work. So that is your mentality. But when you're running a business, it's a 180. It's totally different. Finance and operations is all about best practice. All you need to do is figure out, and a lot of people struggle with this, is like, maybe your technology is new, but your company isn't. What is somebody who's been successful done before you, and why did it work? And just replicate that. There is no plagiarism in business. You do not lose points for having done something that somebody already did. In fact, it's the exact opposite. You gain points because it's pattern recognition. It's all about having trusting and knowing that a process works. It's about being focused. It's saying no to a lot of things. It's like, that is probably one of the most difficult things that I think inventors have, is you see a world of possibilities and saying, like, no, we're only going down this path, and just focusing on that path, and knowing that, you're leaving cards on the table maybe, but ultimately, all things being equal, a focused approach is far, far better than an expansive one. You don't want to be creative. You want to be controlled. I mean, some of you might have heard the concept of internal controls that exist in businesses. Like, businesses are like machines. They just they sort of, they're supposed to turn input into output, and that output is profit. And so, to make sure the machine runs properly, you have controls in terms of the way things are purchased, or the way things are paid for, or the way things are designed, or all these things. It's not, you don't get to be a free agent. You don't get to do whatever you want. You have to follow sort of direction. There's a huge number of dependencies. You're not operating in small teams. Even if you're a lean startup, you're working with multiple partners. I mean, it could be law firms, accounting firms, manufacturers, suppliers, et cetera. You have so many dependencies that you need to manage. And if you are sort of one of these people that, is kind of like, you think you can do it all, or whatnot. And that's true in invention. Like, in invention, it is usually one or two people that have that spark of genius. But in terms of companies and operations, it's distributed. So yeah, you might have a great idea for, I don't know, some technology, but if you have a component, that supplier that supplies that component, that's all they do. They know way more than you do. I mean, you gotta recognize that, you gotta utilize that, and you gotta figure out a way of trusting them, but verifying. And so that's not always obvious to people. That especially come from sort of an inventor background where, again, you're working in for the most part, pretty tight-knit teams. And then lastly, like 0 to 1 and 1 to 100. I mean, for something to operate once, I mean, statistically, maybe it was a fluke. For something to operate 100 times, no, it's not. And that robustness, that reliability, in a lot of cases, when you have to manufacture something that's robust or reliable, or even low margin, et cetera, you need to take away a little bit from the inventiveness. You need to have that balance. So this is, it's the challenge is, if you come from an inventor standpoint or background, is being able to switch that mindset. And if you can't, that's okay. What you have to do is you have to supplement your team with people that do have this mindset, and sort of let them loose, and trust in them to run the business. I do know of somebody, it was a company that was, it was clinician scientists founded, but it had a very experienced management team. And the CEO would literally kick the clinician scientist out of the building, because he would come in and he would have so many great ideas, but it's like, no, we can't do that. I mean, we otherwise we're just gonna, the goal here is not to produce as much research as possible. The goal here, ultimately, you have one goal, and that goal is to return money to shareholders and generate, for lack of this is a very finance term, but it's superior risk adjusted returns, right? You're trying to generate that 40%, which justifies the risk, or more than justifies the risk. You're not trying to, come up with the most patents or anything. So it's this mindset, and I think it can be really difficult. And here's it also works the other way. I mean, the inventors and scientists can get very frustrated with the finance people that are like, oh, we got to do this on this timeline and stuff like that. And science doesn't always work that way. Engineering, it's in many cases it doesn't behave or whatnot. So it's this ability to kind of have both mindsets. And I don't have an inventor mindset. I do have a finance and operations mindset. I can assure you that. I'm very companies need to operate with a certain level of military precision. And I don't mean to use that lightly, that term, but if you think about the way things operate in the military, and have never served, but it's a very chain of command focused, it's systematic, it's all these things. And that's really, really successful companies, I feel, sort of are able to get to that stage. Our CEO, Tom, talks about like no look passes between team members. That's when everybody's on the same page, and you can pass to somebody without them having to look. So anyways, that's sort of how I view the two schools. There is a question or maybe a comment in the chat. So what advice do you have to have this end-to-end mindset in business strategy operations if you're coming from a scientific background? You're often very detail-oriented as opposed to big picture mindset. So I will show you as part of the template, but you need people on your team that are going to supplement it. That is not to say you need the scientists, you need the inventors, they need to stay involved. You need the clinicians, you need the clinical input, you need all that. All those ingredients are necessary, but not sufficient. And I can explain to you how you build a team around you that sort of nurtures that and knows what to do. So we will talk about that. But yes, if you are coming from an inventor science background, that's okay. But it's okay to have that, and it's okay to not have that finance and operations background. But it's important to recognize that you don't have it, and you're going to need to supplement yourself. Hopefully that answers the question. I don't think there's, that was the only question. So, and again, what I've described.
Hi, Stefano. Sorry to interrupt you. I have a question. So as you said, if you are being a inventor or scientist, people generally don't have the mindset of the financial people. And so when is the right time to supplement this with other people or join or make a team? Because as you said, the inventions can be happened by one or two people. That time is good. But when is the right time to involve with these people, and how to find them?
I will explain in the workshop. That's a great question. And we can skip right to the workshop if we'd like, if it's okay with that. But it's a great question. And it's like, it is the right. So here's one of the things that I wanted to convey today, which was the question you're asking is a strategic one. There's tactical questions, which are, like tactical question would be like, how do I file a patent, or, financial model, how do I calculate this, calculate that? Those tactical things are all very, very important. But it's the big strategic things that ultimately kind of decide whether your company's able to, like you said, like, how do I build this team? When do I bring them in? Stuff like that. That's like the big strategic, the big things that ultimately determine whether a company is successful. So I will get to that. I promise you, I do have an answer to that question. I'm not trying to duck it. What I'm trying to say though, is that question is far more important than a question like, well, how do I calculate this in a financial model? That's what I'm trying to get to. So we will, and that's going to be part of the workshop. What are good strategies for startup to raise funds before getting FDA approval bootstrapping? I will explain that as well. That's a great question. I mean, and is it okay? Can we just jump straight to the workshop if that's okay? Because these are all. So the workshop is, if you have never been involved, you could have even worked in a medical device company, but but if you haven't founded one, you haven't been part of founding one, you're probably looking at it like, holy crow, there is just a ton of noise out there. And what is the signal? Like, what am I supposed to do? Because there's so many different, I remember like when I started, I was like thinking about like different buckets, like IP and science and marketing and all this kind of, like, how do you put it all together? And it's like, and if you are sitting there overwhelmed or confused or you don't know, that's totally fine. And I'm going to try and explain it to you in a very strategic way, or at least, and different people might have different opinions. This is what I kind of feel is will represent best practice. If there's somebody out there that's experienced and disagrees with me, I imagine that they probably have a good reason. I'd be very open to hearing their comments. But I think most people wouldn't disagree with this. I hope. And the big question sort of comes down to this chicken and egg between like, I need resources to do things, but I need to do things to get resources, right? Because no investor is going to put money into you if you don't have anything. But at the same time, if you don't have money, how can you do anything, right? So this is like ultimately, I think the issue sort of goes to the two questions that were asked that everybody struggles with was like, well, how do you do that? Okay, so here's what I would do, and this is a little bit more towards somebody coming out of an academic environment. But the first thing you do need to do is you do need to validate the idea a little bit. You need to basically, especially if you're in a low-cost academic setting, there's a lot of grants and stuff like that. You basically you need to show that you can get from 0 to 1, like a proof of concept, or to show like, okay, what I am doing is, is sort of slightly feasible or is potentially feasible. And I imagine most of the people that are on this call that maybe, they biomedical physics students or whatnot would be capable of this. It's not something crazy. Like, I mean, this is actually the purpose of the Medventions program, is in an academic setting, in an academic hospital, to, do clinical needs finding and then try and figure out what a solution might be. That's it. That's all you need to do, is just try to get some idea where you have kind of married the two, and maybe do a little bit of homework around some of the other areas, but you don't need to actually get it too far. And I'll explain, because the next step is by far the most critical, and it is the answer that everybody is looking for. The other thing you absolutely need to do at this stage, because nobody will ever get involved with you ever if you don't do this, is you need to ensure that you have free and clear access to your IP. So if you are at an academic institute like Sunnybrook, and Sunnybrook's been, I think it's been great in terms of working with, the tagline is inventing the future of healthcare. It's been great to see a lot of companies come of it. It's been great to see programs like Innovate, et cetera. You need to make sure, though, that you have free and clear access to the IP, or on terms that are commercially reasonable. And how do you know what's commercially reasonable? I'll show you the next part. But you need to make sure that you're going to, like the IP is not going to be encumbered, because if you don't have access to the IP, you don't have a business. And nobody's ever going to get involved. That's like literally the first question everybody will ask. So that's it. And I think this is something, step one is something that pretty much everybody on this call should be able to do. Now, step two, this is what you're all looking for. This is the answer. This is probably the most critical step. The first thing you should do when you're building a company is you build the board, your board of directors. And maybe it's like a board of directors plus board of advisors. But this is it, because if you are able to get, I would say at least 2, maybe 3 experienced industry professionals that are engaged, that you trust, that have done this before, and that believe in your idea, that is the catalyst to your substrate. That is it. It is the board. And the great thing about a board is not expensive. A board you have to give equity to. Up front, you probably have to give some sort of deferred cash compensation. But ultimately, whether you are able to get experienced board members is the validation that a lot of investors need to decide whether to proceed with this. Because the board members, if somebody is experienced, they will do their due diligence on you. If we're talking about somebody that's got 20, 30 years in industry experience, they will be the signal to investors to say, hey, yes. And it was interesting. So XPAN, I'm on the board, but there's one other person in the Bay Area, super experienced, who's on the board. And he was the intro to the angel group that ended up, sort of doing the first round. I mean, Zaid was able to raise some money through some other groups locally, but I mean, that individual on the board is also a co-founder of the company, who's got 25, 30 years experience, has a pedigree. That was it. That was the catalyst. So if you can convince an experienced, engaged board that people recognize, that have let's say you're doing something in cardiovascular, that have built and sold businesses in cardiovascular, that is hugely, that is the signal you are looking for to move on to the next phase. And the other thing is like, it's also, there's so many questions that you're going to have through this process. It's having these experienced advisors that have been through it and done for before, like don't repeat somebody else's mistake. And, it's like, especially with like XPAN, I mean, I get a lot of emails from Zaid. I don't know if he's on, maybe probably not, because he's already heard all this from me. He doesn't need to know it again. But it's like literally, I mean, anything he emails, like I've seen this before, even basics like insurance, who to go to, who to get as a broker, what are some good terms, what are some decent premiums, what should my limits of coverage be, and it's like also, and again, these are lessons that I've kind of passed down from, Canavi folks that I've worked with and board members that are super experienced and things like that. So, there's like this cycle of this ecosystem. But in a good board members will also know what they don't know. I'm not a commercialization expert. And and so we're making sure with that business, we get the right commercial people on board early to make sure that we have a validated sanity check commercial plan. So that is the, I think that is like, again, that is the first, if you were starting a company, the first thing, I mean, again, after kind of validating that this thing isn't a harebrained idea, that you're not trying to invent perpetual motion or something like that, the very, very first thing you should do is try to form that board. And again, that board, if they are the right board, they will believe in you. They won't be taking cash. You will have to pay them equity. I mean, it won't be insane, but probably low single digits, because again, a board isn't active. A board's not day to day. A board is the people that help you set your direction. They help you manage the company, and they are the people that you turn to for advice. Now, it's a delicate balance between how much advice you get from them, because board's not meant to be operational. But for an early stage company, especially if you're a first-time founder, it is not. I think the right board would be prepared to hold your hand because they recognize that that's just necessary. There is a question in the chat which says, "What are your thoughts of building multiple advisory boards?" Oh, sorry. What are your thoughts of building multiple advisory boards, legal, financial, medical, et cetera, with better pedigrees than the main board? So I think like, so yeah, what you need at the beginning, if you could get sort of like 2 people that have built and sold companies in your area, that is amazing. It becomes a 3-person board, you're the 3rd. I think that is great. Now, beyond that, you do need you're definitely going to need a lawyer. You're going to need somebody to help with finance. You definitely are going to need a clinical advisory board at some point. Like there's all these other, but like it's kind of talking about like who's in the core team. And ideally what you're looking for is people that have been there, done that. That is like the most important thing. And because as you go along your journey and you encounter things, they'll have seen it before, and they can basically warn you of all the traps that are ahead. So that I'm not saying like, yeah, you're definitely going to need a lawyer. You're definitely going to need a clinical advisory board. You're going to need other folks to bring in over time. But here's the other thing: a really good engaged board will also help you know when you need these people, when to bring them on. All those questions about that kind of stuff, it's all gets very tactical. It's all sort of dependent on the type of company you are. And so they'll help you. I mean, they'll also know who's good, right? I mean, I know like who the good, contract engineering groups are and who aren't, and like the regulatory folks. And if you have a problem, who to go to, and a lawyer that's been there and done that. Like, I mean, I've kind of, because you've been around the block, and it's the same thing with the people that I've learned from. They were in around the block, and so they passed it on to me. And so it's like, and so again, I think if you can focus on just getting a couple core people that again have been there, done that, and have been through exits before, that is, I mean, nothing, you talk about investors, nothing gets an investor more interested than somebody that's built and sold a business and done really well. Now, these people are in demand, and so to get them, you're going to have something that's really intriguing, and that's going to be the validation necessary. The next question is why a minimum of 2 super experienced advisors, not 1 or 3? So I think like getting 2 is not easy. I mean, to get actually 2, it's not. I mean, I think so. I think like what you want early is you want a small core team that's really engaged, that works well together. The issue with 1 or the issue with 3, I mean, part of it is like boards should always kind of have an odd number. So I think to me, 3 has always kind of felt right. Now, but that's not to say that, again, you can have other kind of, satellite advisors or people on the side. Like your clinical advisory board shouldn't be on your board of directors. They shouldn't be the ones telling you how to run your business or advising you on major strategy decisions. They should just be the ones that you go to for clinical input and advice and trying to get a sense of, what maybe the market might want. Maybe even like other advisory groups. So it's definitely eventually going to become a group more than 3. But I think like early, that core group, 3 just to me always seems like a good number, and also like a manageable number where you're not, because 5, I think to get 4 other people would be pretty tough. There's another question. What is standard equity percentage to give for board members? It depends on the stage. I would say, and you can look up, there's comps and stuff like that you can look up. It depends on how active they are. It's probably, low single digit percentages. It depends on how engaged they are. The cash comp can vary considerably, again. But it can be anywhere from 20 to 100,000, but any good board member is not going to be taking cash out initially, and they shouldn't, because as a board member, you have a fiduciary duty to the corporation. But ultimately, the only number that's the right number is a negotiation. And ultimately, I would rather give 5% to an excellent board member that's going to be maybe 50 hours a year, but those 50 hours are going to be super, super solid, than 1% to somebody who's prepared to dedicate, I don't know, 5 times as much time, 250 hours, but really doesn't know what they're doing. So ultimately, it comes down to negotiation. The right, and I mean, there's another company that was starting recently, and they asked me the exact same question. I said, the right number is the number that both parties feel comfortable with. That's it. It's usually in the low single digits. Usually when you create like a stock option plan, usually the portion ends up being about 10 or 15%. So, if you give away, 5% to 2 board members, there's nothing left over. So, it's usually in a low single digit. So is it better to invite industry influential leads like doctors or entrepreneurs who have built companies? You want people that have built and sold companies before. And all things being equal, it's mainly industry folks. You do find some doctors that started a company and ended up were successful, took it all the way, but it's very rare. Usually what you want is you want somebody who's built and sold. You want doctors involved, but in a clinical advisory capacity. You don't want them in an operational capacity. Well, not that you don't want them, but I think it's preferable to just have them in a clinical capacity, or somebody providing some clinical advice. So again, if you find some superstar position, that's great. But if they haven't built and sold a company before, I'd be hesitant about putting them on my board. I would definitely seek to make them advisor, absolutely. And all things being equal, by the way, you're going to have to probably pay clinical advisors. You're going to have to pay in cash, and you're going to have to pay some pretty steep rates. Those ones you can't defer. I mean, the other great thing about a board is people that believe in you, they'll be prepared to, they'll show it by riding with you. They were prepared to, by putting their sort of, by walking the walk before they start asking for money. So, okay, so great question. So there's a need to sign, does there a need to sign a contract with board members in order to ensure they have the rights they have in the company before joining? Yes, absolutely. So, and there's a lot of law. So none of this stuff that you're asking, by the way, is new. Like, lawyers have seen this before. So typically, like, a director will have a retention letter, which is basically like their compensation. And then also they will have an indemnification agreement to basically say, like, if something goes wrong, they're not, like, the company will assume certain responsibilities. Directors are liable for a lot of things. That is, when you are a director of a company, you are a fiduciary to the corporation as a whole, meaning that you have to act in the interest of the corporation as a whole, not the shareholders, not management, the whole corporation. And what comes along with that is a lot of implied liability if things go wrong. As an example, if your company has payroll and doesn't properly remit payroll remittances, the board can actually be held liable for that. So usually there's indemnification agreements and other things that are put in place to protect the board a little bit. Those are all standard documents. also like, a board will, or a corporation will usually have bylaws that spell out some of the rights and responsibilities of directors, maybe also shareholders agreement, et cetera. So those are all, those are all like standard things that, if you look, and some lawyers are, like some of this basic stuff they can put together really quick. They may do it on a deferred basis or a discounted basis. What's the difference between an advisor and a board? Great question. So a board legally is very significant. Again, the board is essentially appointed or elected by the shareholders to oversee the affairs of the corporation. And legally, the board, it has responsibility for overseeing the corporation, also hiring and firing the CEO. It's sort of its two big responsibilities. So like being a director is a very sort of important codified legal position. An advisor is more like a consultant. You don't have that liability. You're not like, a board can pass a resolution, whatever they pass, the corporation has to do. And if the corporation doesn't do that, they fire the CEO. Advisor, you don't have that kind of power. Like a corporation is truly run by the directors, and the CEO reporting to the directors. That's where sort of the flow of power is. And so that's the big difference, is when you're a director, you take on a lot more responsibility. Now, here's the thing. When you're starting a company, you don't need to formally make like, let's say you find two people that you really like and you want to make them directors. They don't like necessarily need to be directors, maybe the advisors, but the good thing about making them directors is it shows that they got like skin in the game. Like they're prepared to stand behind this thing, because you don't accept a directorship lightly. You don't, like, you got to be, people that know how to be a good director know you don't just walk into any situation. You got to study it carefully. And so if you're able to get somebody on that's a really good board member, that is, to investors that know what they're doing, that is a huge signal. Next question. Some VCs like Antler give 150K for 10% equity, funds administered through a simple agreement for future equity safe, since Y Combinator popularized it. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of accelerators. There's definitely some great, and it might work better for other industries like, I don't know, software or other tech areas. I'm not a huge fan of accelerators. I wouldn't, I mean, if that's the route you go down, so be it. I think like, but that's not to take away from safes. Safes are good. 10% for 150K, as a seed round isn't completely, I mean, that's a post money of 1.5. It's not, it's not unreasonable. But I'm just not, like, here's the thing. A lot of people are going to have a lot of opinions about a lot of things. These are just my opinions. This is what I've seen. Some people could certainly disagree with me. But I would stay away from accelerators. There's great groups like MedTech Innovator, the Fogarty Institute, et cetera. That they help you accelerate your business. They're not like true accelerators. I'm not sure actually about the Fogarty Institute, but they really help. Like, you getting involved with those is great. Obio is a great group to get involved with. Like, they provide a lot of counseling. They're not looking for equity or anything like that. So there's a lot of groups like that. But I historically have not been big fans of accelerators. I mean, I know a lot of people do Creative Destruction Lab. I'm not sure the structure there. I think it's more just kind of counseling. I don't think they, put money into you, et cetera. Yeah, I mean, I would, again, if I was doing this, I would go straight to the board. And then there's a comment about that's largely dependent on things you like, any IP you bring to the table. Yeah, I mean, what you're looking for on a board is you are looking for like the 4 T's. So time, which basically means, are they engaged? Which doesn't necessarily mean they need to spend hours with you, but means like when you need them, will they answer? Are they responsible? Do they care? Or are they responsive? Do they care? Talent, do they know what they're doing? And by far the most important thing on talent is, have they been there, done that? Are they ahead of you? Have they been through sort of the battle, so to speak? Treasure. So anybody who has built and sold a company has access to, not necessarily their own money, but knows people who can invest, right? And a board is, like, in terms of opening investment opportunities, man, a board is like, they can be hugely helpful. And the last thing is trust. You need to be able to work together as a board, because if that group of 3 isn't cohesive, it's not all on the same page, that can make life extraordinarily difficult. Because let's just say this, I mean, most sort of bylaws or shareholder agreements make it extraordinarily difficult to remove a board member, extraordinarily difficult. And it's by design. And it's because private companies, you want to minimize as drama as possible. You don't want, if you watch Succession on HBO, you don't want that. You want predictability when you're a private company, or at least any company, but like you don't want all this crazy drama and stuff like that. So anyways, are there any more questions? There's good questions about board members. This is the big one. This is the big one that I think everybody is probably wondering about. But this is, to me, this is the catalyst, and it's not easy to get good board members involved. But I think it's the one where, if you're starting a company, it's where you should focus your time and attention after you validated the idea, because it's the one that will answer the rest, will help answer the remaining questions you have and set you on your path. Okay, I don't think there's any more questions about board members, so we'll move on to the next stage. And then, or the next stage is, and a good board will do this. It's all about defining your milestones and the money you need to get there. And and so what is a milestone? Is a fancy way of saying, like, it's something you accomplish that makes your business more valuable. So I think, companies, and usually you can categorize them as two companies, or two different types of companies. You have your 510Ks, your non-therapeutics, which like 95+% of medical device companies sort of tend to fall more in that range, maybe a little less. Or you have your, maybe less. I mean, it depends on sort of how you're caught. A lot of companies go through the 510K pathway, but are in substance therapeutic in order to really drive adoption, or need to demonstrate good data to drive adoption. I guess any company does, but anyway, so I mean, but there's kind of the 510K, and then there's like the PMA, the therapeutic route, where you need like your kind of big studies. So milestone number, let's just focus on the 510Ks, where it's a simpler device. You're not going after something like renal denervation, where you got to demonstrate it, or like mitral valve, where you got to demonstrate it in a gazillion patients. So your first milestone should be FDA clearance. You should figure out how much money do you need in order to, once you formed your board, once you got your company, to get to FDA clearance and raise to that. Now, there's other things that are going to happen concurrently, filing patents and blah, blah, blah. But, and then starting to do some sort of commercial outreach and stuff like that. But really, the first thing that investors are going to be looking at is, okay, how much money do you need to get to clearance? And also, how much time is it going to take? But raise enough money to get there. The second thing is, once you have clearance, having enough money such that you can demonstrate, you can go through a limited commercial release, or I should have put this here, you can have evidence of, you can have you can have clinical evidence to support your utility. So that's the second thing is it doesn't have to be in a lot of patients. It can be in a study, it can be real world. It should probably actually be both, but it's showing like, hey, your company or your product is actually something that's really intriguing. And actually, in some cases, you can exit after milestone 2. People will buy you, especially if you got your ducks in a row around manufacturing and some other areas, or even not. I mean, even if you have a plan to get that ready. Limited commercial release can definitely be enough. But milestone 3, which you're probably going to have to go down, is showing like meaningful revenue, showing maybe 10 million of revenue plus like really good COGS, plus like showing that you have serious traction. And then that's what leads to an exit. Like if you have a company that has meaningful revenue, high margin, or high margin recurring revenue, and it's an acknowledged sort of need, you're going to get acquired. You're going to have people knocking on your door. You can always walk away though. You can always walk away. You don't have to. But this is like a good board will do. We'll say like, what are the milestones that we need to get to? How much money do we need to raise to get to these? Because all of these things are value inflection points. Now, if you go like the more like PMA or therapeutic route, it's all about data. So your first milestone is probably preclinical data. Your second milestone is, preliminary safety and efficacy human data. It would be like a biotech, probably like a phase 1/phase 2A. And then milestone 3 would be concluding your pivotal. Now, if you're phase 1 or phase 2A data, maybe your phase 2A, like your preliminary efficacy data is really nice, somebody could buy it. But that is for a select category of devices that are very sort of therapeutic in nature, or very kind of like imaging would not fall in that category. Like what we do at Canavi would not. It's in the category in the lab. You got to sort of demonstrate sort of, for the most part, traction. Now, there are exceptions to these circumstances, absolutely. But what you're going to be thinking about when you're starting this company, you build with the end in mind. You say, where is my exit? What's my likely exit? And I would assume in each case, you got to get to milestone 3. And just say, okay, how much money am I going to need over each phase? to get to each point, and how much time am I going to need, and what are the other resources, who are the people, et cetera. And you build there, and a very good board will sanity check and walk you through this and evaluate it. And we do this at Canavi, I do this at XPAN. Like it is best practice. It is basically, you are setting out your whatever, your the path that exists in front of you and figuring out with the end in mind. And here's the thing, nothing ever goes according to plan. And sometimes you get pleasantly surprised and things happen sooner. Acquirers come earlier. But that being said, you need it doesn't matter how hard you row if you're rowing in the wrong direction. So this helps you row in the right direction. There is a question in the chat that says, what's the difference between board members and co-founders? So usually usually a company is co-founded by more than one person. Usually you'll have a couple. And usually, the co-founder, usually those are, the co-founders are the ones that usually split, the initial big equity. With the caveat being that, provided they're involved in the business on a day-to-day basis going forward. So the worst thing you can do is start a company, issue a bunch of shares to all the co-founders, and then a bunch of the co-founders walk away. There's something called, vesting or clawbacks or things like that. You want to make it clear that you get these shares provided you continue to be involved in the business. Now, let's say somebody helps invent, but they want to walk away. Sure, maybe you give them 5%. Maybe you give them something. You want to give them something, but you would give more to somebody that founds it and is actively involved and is going to help run it, et cetera. Now, it's very common for the co-founders to end up in the board. If you wanted, let's say there were 2 co-founders and you wanted a board, then you're probably going to want 3 other board members in that case. I think usually the co-founders among them should nominate one person who's going to be to the board, and the other 2 should be people that you find, industry experts. Now, here's the thing. Ultimately, the board is chosen by the shareholders. So if you have a co-founder that's not a shareholder, or sorry, that's not a board member, but is a pretty sizable shareholder, they can always vote to, they can always, they have power to kind of get rid of them. So that's the distinction, is that not all co-founders necessarily have to be board members. That's something that every company gets to decide. But I would be if a company has 6 co-founders, I would not put all 6 on the board. A board of 5, and here's the thing is like, especially if you have, industry experts that have been there, done it, they're very busy people. And you want to try scheduling a meeting with 5 people that are very busy, good luck. You're going to be like, it's not fun. So like 3 makes it a lot easier. I talked about that engagement thing. And the last thing you want is, having different meetings with different people. You want everybody in the same room, sort of like engaged thinking, right? A concentration of forces. So yeah, usually I would recommend, if there's a group of co-founders, kind of picking one lead co-founder to kind of represent the group on the board. But knowing again that the rest of the co-founders could be material from a shareholder standpoint. Any other questions about sort of defining your milestones, your capital requirements? Again, you start with the end in mind. You got to be building towards an end. What is a reasonable standard timeline for startup companies to achieve these respective milestones? I'd say like the fastest, like the 5-10K path, from like the day you decide I'm going to start a company to the day you exit, I'm probably going to say maybe the fastest you could do it is in 5 years. You're probably going to take at least a year to validate and get the board on side. That's not easy. And then, then let's say it takes you 6 months to do a raise, 3.5 years, that is like light speed. Because if you think about like even product development, the FDA, the FDA is 6 months. I don't care who you are. It's going to be 6 months. You're going to get an additional information request. They're going to ask for more data. So if you can do it that fast, there are companies that do it faster, but they're very, very, very rare. But I would say like, 5 is probably the fastest you can go. The median's probably 7. Although again, it's not, remember when we talk about returns, it's the date you raise money, not the date you start the company. So that's one thing to consider is like, well, that 5, maybe you did in 3.5. And maybe you didn't, maybe you didn't raise a whole bunch up front. Maybe the board is like, oh yeah, we'll just raise a little bit from family and friends. And maybe your biggest round is until a little bit later, right? But I think it can be done, if you're really, really good. Yeah, I mean, like from the date you first raise money, like 3.5 years. I think it's possible. The PMA therapeutic route is going to take a lot longer, probably 10 plus, because it's all about clinical studies, and that takes a long time. That's more like biotech timelines, like 10 plus years. If you have a clinical advisory board, are they expected to meet together annually, semi-annually, or should they be consulted individually? Typically, so here's the thing is that like a board of directors, I feel, should always meet collectively as a group, because everybody needs to be on the same page. Like, you don't want a board that's people are thinking different things. That's just bad. For the rest of your clinical, like if clinical advisors, that's an interesting one. So like it depends which area you're in medicine, but you see, like, so Canavi, intravascular imaging, the opinions are all over the place. Like, everybody's got a different opinion in terms of what they want in an intravascular imaging system and what they think works and what doesn't, et cetera. And so we definitely have regular meetings with groups, typically clustered around conferences because they're all there. But in most cases, it's kind of ad hoc. It's like, it's one-on-one. And then the challenge is synthesizing it. I mean, everything is like clinical advisory board meetings. Again, scheduling 3 doctors to find the same time to meet, that's more difficult than building and selling a company. Like, that's really tough. So it's a little bit of both, but I think, yeah, I got one laugh. Thank you. I got one laugh. But yeah, no, I think the clinical advisors, that one is it sort of varies, but individually is fine. You don't need a financial advisor. You only need one person that knows what they're doing in finance to guide you. You need a day-to-day finance person. Usually, you can find somebody outsourced. You don't need a financial advisory board. You shouldn't need a technical advisory board. That's like a bunch of engineers. That should be more kind of people that you bring in-house. I think probably the biggest, like your biggest external advisors besides the board, you're gonna want a good lawyer. Not somebody that you went to school, like somebody who's been there, done that, been practicing for 10, 15 years, that has a lot of other medical device clients. You're gonna, like a good accountant that can do like your tax return and stuff like that. Like that's like your shreds, your R&D tax credits. But other than that, and then your clinical advisory board, that's sort of, and then also actually, your biggest partners, and these aren't really advisors, but they're more partners, are going to be your suppliers, your manufacturers, the contract engineering groups that you work with. So they're not advisors per se, but they are very, very, very important partners, very important partners. And so, and here's the thing is that, I've seen this happen a lot where you have a supplier or contractor that's been doing, they've been in business for years, and you have somebody that's a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed engineer that's like, why are you doing that? Why not do something, blah, blah, blah? And it's like, you got to respect the experience, even if you don't agree with it. Because usually even if you don't understand it, usually there's a reason. Usually there's a really good reason. So I'm not saying like, I think what people are looking for here, you're looking for very tactical answers and very operational answers. I can't give them to you because it depends a lot on the circumstances and a lot on the company. I can give you strategic themes. And those themes include, again, the importance of a board, of other partners, advisors. There's a comment now, I'm coming at this from an NPO charity point of view. I did briefly years ago sit on the board of a charity. I think it's night and day. I have very little NPO experience, but I think sitting on a not-for-profit board and sitting on the board of a startup, it's a 180. It's totally different. What you're going to need from the folks, everything, the approach, etc. It's not bad to have board experience from a not-for-profit, but it's better than no board experience. But it is really, really, really night and day. Any more questions on this? I really appreciate the questions. These are very good. What's the likely process to have for funds raising after sharing with board members and co-founders? Usually like, a seed stage, you're raising at maybe a I don't know, 1 or 2 million, I mean, for your post-money valuation, you see a lot of safes, excuse me, that aren't priced, that convert to the next round. And it depends on a lot of factors. Depends on the, it depends availability of capital, and I mean, God forbid Silicon Valley went under, but good luck looking for capital after that. It would have been extraordinarily difficult. So, those are for the size and stage of the business. That's something the board members will help you with. They will be able to figure out exactly, who, the groups that you're speaking with, probably what's their touch points. But yeah, I mean, if you're a seed stage, yeah, if you are raising your first dollar, to do it, more than $1 million pre-post can be pretty challenging. I mean, if you need to raise a little bit more, and even here's another thing is like, so I gave you these milestones to raise to, but here's the thing is that even within the 5-10K, there's a lot of different ways to slice the pie. You might do sort of tranched approaches where, maybe the first thing is you want to do an animal experiment, because that'll give confidence to investors that actually the device has some substance, or maybe like there could, here's the thing, what I'm trying to say is there could be some intermediary milestones here, but these I would say are the big ones that really kind of flip the switch in terms of investor interest. So there could be some intermediary milestones, and therefore it depends on your circumstances. I can't give you specific technical answers. It depends on the company, et cetera. I can give you themes, and the theme is you raise as little, you raise what you need to get to the next inflection point. You try to accomplish it as quickly as possible, because going back to the very first thing that I said, returns are a function of multiples in time. And then the last thing is to execute, which is like, it's if you don't have the plan in place, I don't care how good you are, you're going to execute. But once you have the plan in place, it's about getting stuff done and making sure that you're accomplishing all the things that you set out to do. And truly, medical device companies are built top down, not bottom up, which means if something is going wrong or if something's going right, it's because of the top. It's not because of the bottom. It's not because of the one quality person you hired or the engineer or whatever. It's because the people leading this thing need to get their act in order, need to take inventory of the resources they have, the money, all these things. And one of the things that I find is a lot of people think bottom up. They think in terms of like, oh, a number of engineers, all that kind of stuff. No, you think top down from the board. That's how you build a medical device company. Because a good board member will save you from the strategic mistakes that no amount of tactical acuity will ever help you with. So yeah, there's another question in the chat. Thank you. Well, thank you. I mean, I really appreciate you guys, listening to me. It's about 6 o'clock, so I finished in I think an hour and a half. So, but yeah, no, I mean, this is I've seen mistakes, made mistakes myself. There's a way to do it. There's a way not to do it. But here's the thing: even though I give you this plan, it's not easy. It's not like, don't expect the world to roll out the red carpet. Science never behaves the way you want it to. The world never behaves the way you want. I mean, again, you could have followed this plan to a T. You could have been absolutely elite. But if you had banked with Silicon Valley Bank and they had gone under, that's just the risk you run. Like, that's just it. And so no matter who you are, the world will sink its claws into you eventually. That's just the rest. It's just that you could be walking down the street, get hit by a bus, unfortunately. That's life. But by following this, I think it sets you up for the best probability of success. That's what it is. It's managing probabilities. And I think this is a pretty good, sort of high-level formula to follow. Another question. Oh, any book you would recommend to read regarding medical device startups and top-down strategy? Yeah, so great question. Actually, in the past, I used to recommend books. So one book that's really good. Oh, sorry, can we revisit the second equation as well? Yeah, it's right here. It's, it's basically you take your multiple and whatever root to the t minus 1 equals your return. It's all derived from this. It's a compounded annual rate of return, right? So this is like 1 times 1 plus r to the t equals x, right? You assume that there's like a 1 here. So there was like, like this is that's how I sort of arrived at this. So like multiple of 3 could be like, if you're able to see my cursor, like a 300 in the X and 100 here. So it's like a 300 over 100 is 3. Hopefully that helps. So best books I have ever read. Okay. So the first one is, I would recommend, has nothing to do with medical technology. It is Shoe Dog by Phil Knight. And what it does, sorry, I just got a text message. What it does, so for those who are not familiar with, I mean, Nike's this hugely successful corporation. You know, but started out, his first 11 years, it was awful. And the guy who founded it, Phil Knight, he struggled a lot those first 11 years. And the book only recounts the first 11 years. It doesn't talk about his successes. It only talks about his difficulties. But the fundamental premise of Shoe Dog is that Phil Knight founded the company because he was seeking a purpose. He was a runner. In the 60s or early 70s, being a runner meant you were weird. It's not like today where everybody runs. Back then you were weird. He went to University of Oregon, which had a track coach that was very experimental with shoes. He was just something about it. He was driven by purpose. And the moral of that book is that, you know, there's the famous expression, Viktor Frankl, he who has a why, who can endure any how. And, you know, that was taken from an extreme example, but you realize that one of the things that drives drives successful entrepreneurs is that purpose. And so a lot of times when, you know, I've been in very adverse circumstances, I have thought about the purpose of why I'm doing this. And ultimately, yes, you were doing this ultimately legally, you were doing this to enrich shareholders. That's your legal obligation. But there's patience. There are, you know, it's you're doing it for the patients. Those are the ones that matter. So that's a great book on purpose. Another great book on, oh yeah, I think I have it right here, is this one. It's more textbookish, is Venture Deals, which is really good on like cap tables and stuff like that. You don't need to be an expert in this. You don't need to read it. I mean, you know, I did because I'm a finance guy, so I did, but this is a good introduction. The biodesign textbooks are really good introduction. It's really detailed. You know, but probably the best resources you can get in terms of actually one other thing that's great is the Fogarty Institute. Andrew Cleland, he puts out, on YouTube, he has a seminar series or like an interview series with a lot of famous clinician scientists, people more that have founded companies as opposed to run them. But guys like Marty Leone, Craig Simpson, Tom Fogarty, who's like, he's a legend. You know, like listening to those people, those are all very, very valuable resources. So I tend to be, it's interesting when it comes to books, I tend to gravitate more towards people's stories and people triumphing over adversity. When it comes to actual resources and textbooks, I tend to prefer talking to people and actually living it out, being in an immersive environment. And that's actually, you know, one of the reasons I think Medventions is so valuable is because you get to do it in an immersive way. There's other questions here in the chat, and it seems like there's some talk of non-dilutive financing. So, good strategy to get non-dilutive funding to delay venture funding. So, you know, I think Ahmed, you went to it. Here, I'll put it in the chat. So, Fogarty Institute on YouTube. Then there's Shoe Dog by Phil Knight. There is Venture Deals by Brad Feld. There is Biodesign by Yop et al. There's you know, there's you know, in terms of industry resources, there's like Fierce MedTech. MedTech Innovator out of California is a great group as an incubator. They're great. Paul Grant, who runs it, is like, they do an exceptional, they've had so many successes too, which has been super impressive. But yeah, I mean, most importantly, you know, read things, but cultivate people in your network. Like cultivate, you know, like you got to get out there, you got to talk to folks. So, and actually one advantage that clinician scientists do have when they're starting companies is they get people's attention more than other folks. That's a big thing. Let's see if there's other questions. Yeah, you know, one of the things about Canada, and Canada is great for non-dilutive capital to get things rolling. Canada is great. So in an academic setting, you should be able to find enough such that you can at least get the ball rolling and complete stage one. There should be, you just got to kind of be creative, and maybe you got to kick some of your own money in just to do some very basic things, but it's not, you shouldn't be spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe like 10 or 20 grand just to do some basic stuff. I wouldn't recommend anything more than that, because after that, it's, if you don't have any sort of validation, you have board members, etc. Yeah. So actually, the one thing that's good, clinical conferences, meeting people, getting out there, that's always really good. That's actually a good use of money if you wanted to travel and go places and try to meet people. I would think in like a clinical or scientific I wouldn't do industry conferences until you're a little bit more mature. But that's also a good route. Any other questions? These are really good. These are all. And yeah, the best. Unfortunately, in many cases, the best teacher is failing and having to overcome your failures. But one of the things that I really like, when I started my journey 10 years ago, there weren't a lot of people in this ecosystem that, really knew what was going on. I mean, it barely survived the global financial crisis. There's a lot more people around that know what they're doing and are willing to help. So it's, yeah, that's my piece. So, yeah, unless there's anything else, I think, happy, I think we can adjourn.
Stefano, thank you very much. It was such a good, outstanding presentation, and thank you for lots of best practices lessons.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think here's, anybody wants to reach out to me, this is my contact info. So, my Twitter account. Feel free if you have any, feel free to reach out. I mean, busy guy and don't have time for everything, but try to do what I can to help folks in the ecosystem.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I actually have one question for you.
Absolutely.
You talked earlier about the Silicon Valley Bank collapse, and
yeah,
one of the questions I had for you was, how do you see this collapse impacting Canadian technologies or companies?
Yeah. So first off, I don't know, because it's not over yet. I mean, there's still a little bit of contagion. There's still some nervousness in terms of think about it. Everybody here puts money in a bank. Think about if tomorrow you had concerns about getting that money out of a bank. That's what businesses are thinking about right now. And even people to some extent as well. I mean, Silicon Valley Bank didn't take personal deposits, but anyways, but it's not over yet. I think for the most part, though, the Canadian banking system is safe. The Canadian banking system, I have a lot of frustrations with it because it's an oligopoly. It's super expensive. They're not particularly forward thinking, but they're super safe. And it's interesting. Long story short, I've had a chance to sort of meet the CEO of CIBC a handful of times, and every time I've heard him speak or I've had a chance to speak with him, all he does, his name is Victor Doty, all he does is talk about his responsibility is to ensure depositors. And yeah, you know what? Because otherwise the bank will fail, and otherwise we will have total chaos. So I think the Canada, our banking system will be secure. The issue is it's the U.S. sneezes and Canada catches a cold. If something drastic happens in the U.S. Let's say a major bank does collapse, whatever fallout there is there, we will definitely see in Canada. One of the major concerns with Silicon Valley Bank was it wasn't necessarily just the companies that had money, there was the VCs, right? And so, if you have, VCs that don't have access to their capital, holy crow, I mean, obviously that applies a little bit more to later stage, but even the thing is if you're an angel investor and you know that venture capitalists aren't there, you're not going to be willing to participate. So it has this whole sort of compounding chain link effect that, yeah, so I'm still, last weekend was pretty nervous, pretty nerve wracking. And I don't think it's over yet. So I recommend every day checking the Wall Street Journal, see what's going on. That's one of my favorite resources from a newspaper. And they do a pretty good job of keeping everything up to date and being sort of unbiased and impartial.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Stefano. That was great. So I realize it's 6:06. Thank you again for being so generous with your time and educating our students and community. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. And our next session is going to be on Thursday, March 23rd. We're having a session on the research and development strategy in medical technology. And so we hope to see you next week. Thank you again and have a good night. Thanks, Stefano.